You're not even his real father, Thomas. We both know it. Sooner or later, everyone will. The words, delivered with a chilling, almost bored indifference by Cassandra, my ex-wife, echoed in the sterile, overly air-conditioned meeting room of the Family Mediation Center. Our 8-year-old son, Leo, sat between us, his small shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the worn pattern of the carpet, a silent, unwilling audience to this latest salvo in Cassandra's ongoing campaign of emotional attrition. My name is Thomas Ashton, 47 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I have been a forensic botanist, a specialist in analyzing plant-based trace evidence in criminal investigations. My world revolves around meticulous observation, the patient extraction of microscopic truths from complex, often contaminated samples. Cassandra's pronouncement, however, was not a complex sample. It was a crude, bludgeoning instrument designed to inflict maximum damage with minimal finesse. I felt Leo flinch beside me, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that registered on my internal seismograph with the force of a major tremor. I placed a reassuring hand on his knee, my own expression, I hoped, remaining impassive. Arguing with Cassandra in this state, in front of Leo, was like trying to reason with a Category 5 hurricane. Futile, and likely to result in significant collateral damage. The mediator, a well-meaning but clearly out-of-her-depth woman named Ms. Albright, blinked, her professional composure momentarily faltering. "Now, Ms. Ashton," she began, her voice a little too bright, "I'm sure we can discuss Leo's holiday schedule without resorting to personal accusations." Cassandra merely shrugged, a picture of unearned confidence in her expensive, sharply tailored suit, a suit I vaguely recalled paying for during the last, acrimonious year of our marriage. "It's not an accusation, Ms. Albright," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. "It's a simple statement of biological fact, a fact that Thomas, for some reason, seems determined to ignore. Or perhaps," she added, her gaze flicking towards me with a predatory gleam, "he's hoping to profit from. Continued association with Leo does, after all, maintain his tenuous connection to the Ashton family wealth, doesn't it?" The Ashton family wealth. That, I knew, had always been Cassandra's primary focus, her lodestar, the glittering prize she had pursued with a singular, almost pathological dedication since the day she had first set her sights on me. The quiet, unassuming son of a moderately successful, but by no means ostentatiously wealthy, manufacturing magnate. My father, a man of quiet integrity and shrewd business acumen, had seen through Cassandra's superficial charm from the outset. He had, with characteristic foresight, structured his estate in such a way that my inheritance, while comfortable, was largely protected within a series of complex trusts designed to shield it from precisely the kind of opportunistic avarice Cassandra now so blatantly displayed. Trusts that, I suspected, were the current focus of her and her notoriously aggressive legal team's frustrated attentions. I didn't rise to her bait. I simply looked at her, my expression calm, my gaze steady. "Cassandra," I said, my voice even, "our discussion today is about Leo's Christmas holiday schedule, as per the court order. Your opinions on my paternal status, or my financial motivations, are neither relevant nor, frankly, particularly original. We've been over this ground before." Repeatedly, her lips thinned. She hated it when I refused to engage, when I met her emotional pyrotechnics with calm, factual detachment. It was like dousing her carefully ignited fireworks with a bucket of very cold, very rational water. "It will become relevant, Thomas," she hissed, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Very relevant. When Leo is old enough to understand. When he asks the questions you can't answer. When he realizes that the man he calls Dad is nothing more than a biological placeholder. A fraud." Leo, beside me, made a small, distressed sound, burying his face against my arm. My heart contracted. This was her true cruelty, using our son, our beautiful, innocent son, as a weapon in her relentless campaign to wound and diminish me. I pulled Leo closer, stroking his hair, my own anger a cold, hard knot in my chest. "That's enough, Cassandra," I said, my voice dangerously quiet now. "You will not speak like that in front of our son again. Do you understand me?" For a moment, I thought she might actually push back, her arrogance overriding her usually keen sense of self-preservation when faced with my rare but unyielding anger. But then, she seemed to deflate slightly, a flicker of something, caution, fear, in her eyes. She knew, from past experience, that there was a line, a boundary of paternal protection around Leo that I would not allow her to cross, regardless of the personal cost. Ms. Albright, flustered, intervened. Perhaps we should take a short break? Allow everyone to compose themselves." "No, Ms. Albright," I said, my gaze still locked on Cassandra. "No break is necessary. We will conclude this discussion about Leo's holiday schedule as planned. And then, Cassandra, you and I will have a separate conversation. A very specific, and I assure you, very final conversation about your assertions regarding Leo's paternity." I reached into my briefcase, the one I always carried, filled with meticulously organized files, scientific journals, and occasionally, the carefully prepared tools of my forensic trade. My fingers closed around a thick, sealed envelope. An envelope that had been residing in that briefcase, a silent, patient time bomb, for the past 6 months, waiting for precisely this moment, this catalyst. An envelope that contained the irrefutable, scientifically validated, and legally admissible truth. Cassandra watched me, her eyes narrowing, a new, uneasy curiosity replacing her earlier smugness. She knew me well enough to know that I rarely engaged in idle threats or empty theatrics. If I said I had something to discuss, something specific and final, then I invariably did. The contents of that envelope, I knew, would not just challenge her narrative. They would utterly demolish it, along with any lingering hopes she might have of using Leo's paternity as a weapon, or as a leverage point in her ongoing and increasingly desperate attempts to extract more money from me or from my family's estate. The game, the one she had been playing with such cruel, calculated abandon for so long, was about to come to an abrupt, and for her, entirely unwelcome, end. The forensic botanist, the man who dealt in microscopic truths, was about to present his final, unassailable findings on the rather toxic specimen that was his ex-wife's deceit. And the analysis, I knew, would be devastating. The path to this sterile mediation room, to Cassandra's venomous pronouncements and Leo's silent distress, had been a long and disillusioning one. Our marriage, which had begun with what I, in my then naivete, believed to be genuine affection and shared dreams, had slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, eroded under the constant, corrosive pressure of Cassandra's insatiable ambition and her growing obsession with wealth and status. We had met in graduate school. I was immersed in the arcane world of forensic botany, fascinated by the silent testimony of plant life, the microscopic clues that could unravel complex crimes. Cassandra was studying art history, or rather, she was studying the art of social climbing. Her curriculum focused more on gallery openings and influential patrons than on Anderson's deep appreciation for aesthetics or scholarship. I had been drawn to her vivacity, her quick wit, her apparent confidence, a stark contrast to my own more introverted, academic nature. She, I later realized, had been drawn to my surname, Ashton, and the perceived access it offered to a world of old money and established social standing that she so desperately craved. My father, Harrison Ashton, a self-made man who had built his manufacturing empire from a small machine shop into a global enterprise, had been, as I mentioned, a man of quiet integrity and considerable financial acumen. He was also a shrewd judge of character. His initial assessment of Cassandra, after our first excruciatingly awkward family dinner, had been delivered with his characteristic laconic precision. "She's a climber, Thomas, and she's got her crampons buried deep in your backside. Watch your wallet and your heart." I had, foolishly, dismissed his concerns as old-fashioned prejudice, the overprotective grumbling of a father wary of any woman who might distract his studious son. I had been wrong, so very wrong. For the first few years of our marriage, Cassandra had played the part of the supportive, if somewhat uncomprehending, spouse. She'd feigned interest in my research, attended the occasional academic conference with me, though she spent most of her time networking with the wealthier trustees rather than attending the actual lectures, and had generally maintained a facade of contentment with our comfortable, if not extravagant, lifestyle. The birth of Leo, 8 years ago, had initially seemed to solidify our bond. I had been overjoyed, throwing myself into fatherhood with a passion that surprised even myself. Leo was, and is the undisputed center of my universe, a bright, curious, and deeply sensitive child who inherited my love for nature and my quiet, observant demeanor. Cassandra, however, seemed to view motherhood less as a joy and more as an inconvenient but potentially useful accessory. She'd hired a series of expensive nannies, outsourced most of the practicalities of childcare, and focused her energies on re-entering the social world, now with the added cachet of being Mrs. Thomas Ashton, mother of the Ashton heir apparent, a title she seemed to have bestowed upon Leo without consulting me. The cracks in our marriage began to widen. Her spending became more extravagant, her demands more insistent. She developed a new circle of friends, a coterie of equally ambitious, materialistic women who seemed to view their husbands primarily as financial facilitators for their increasingly expensive lifestyles. My own work, my passion for forensic botany, which had once intrigued her, now became a source of open derision. "Honestly, Thomas," she'd said to me once, after I'd excitedly tried to explain a breakthrough I'd made in using pollen analysis to pinpoint the location of a clandestine grave, "is that all you do? Mess about with dirt and dead leaves? When are you going to do something significant? Something that matters in the real world?" Her real world, of course, was a world of charity galas, designer boutiques, and endless competitive status displays. A world where my quiet, meticulous, and often profoundly impactful scientific work was deemed irrelevant, almost embarrassing. The final, irreparable rupture had come about 2 years ago. My father, Harrison, passed away after a short illness. His will, as I had always known it would be, was a masterpiece of careful planning and equitable distribution, but with robust safeguards. My inheritance was substantial, but it was placed within a tightly controlled trust, administered by a panel of independent trustees, including my solicitor, Alastair Finch, with clear stipulations that the principal was to be preserved for future generations, and that distributions to me were to be for reasonable living expenses, continued research, and, crucially, for Leo's education and well-being. There was no vast, easily accessible lump sum for Cassandra to get her perfectly manicured hands on. Her disappointment had been palpable, a cold, bitter fury that she barely bothered to conceal. "A trust?" she'd shrieked, after Alastair had patiently explained the terms to us. "He left in a trust? Like I'm some sort of irresponsible child? This is an insult, Thomas. Your father never liked me. He's controlling us even from the grave." Her reaction had been the final, damning piece of evidence in the long, sad audit of our marriage. It wasn't about love or partnership or shared grief. It was about money. It had always been about money. The divorce, when it came a few months later, initiated by me, had been acrimonious. Cassandra, furious at being denied access to the Ashton family fortune she felt was her due, had fought tooth and nail for every conceivable asset. Her lawyers had tried to argue for a disproportionate share of our marital property, citing her sacrifices as a stay-at-home mother, a role largely performed by nannies, and her contribution to my, non-existent in her eyes, career. It was during these bitter divorce proceedings, in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to gain leverage, to inflict maximum emotional damage, that she had first unleashed her most venomous weapon. The insinuation that I was not Leo's biological father. "He looks nothing like you, Thomas," she'd sneered across the polished table of her lawyer's office. "Have you ever really looked at him? At his eyes? His hair? He's all me. Perhaps you should consider alternative paternal scenarios. The implication was clear, the cruelty breathtaking. She was willing to bastardize her own son, to cast doubt on his very identity, merely to wound me, to gain a tactical advantage in a financial dispute. At the time, I had been too stunned, too hurt, too focused on protecting Leo from the fallout of our disintegrating marriage to fully process the monstrousness of her insinuation. I had dismissed it as another of her desperate, vindictive lies. But the seed of doubt, once planted, however maliciously, has a way of taking root. And Cassandra, sensing a vulnerability, had continued to nurture it, to water it with periodic, casual, cruel remarks, like the one she had just delivered in Ms. Albright's mediation room. It was about 6 months ago, after one particularly vicious comment from her during a tense exchange about Leo's school fees, that I had decided enough was enough. I could no longer live with this insidious, unspoken question mark hanging over the most precious relationship in my life. Not for my sake, but for Leo's. He deserved the unequivocal truth, whatever that truth might be. And so, with a heavy heart, but a clear resolve, I had consulted Alastair Finch, not just as my solicitor, but as a trusted friend, a man of immense discretion and wisdom. I had explained Cassandra's claims, my own gnawing uncertainty, my paramount concern for Leo's well-being. Alastair had listened, his expression grave. "Thomas," he'd said, "this is a deeply distressing situation. But you are right. Leo deserves the truth, and you deserve peace of mind. There's a way to ascertain the facts discreetly and definitively." He had then arranged it. A reputable, court-approved DNA testing facility. A simple, painless cheek swab from Leo, obtained during one of our regular weekend visits, explained to him as a special science project for Dad's work. Another sample from me. The results had been delivered to Alastair's office a week later, in a sealed, tamper-proof envelope. That envelope, the one now resting in my briefcase, contained more than just a laboratory report. It contained the truth. It contained the power to silence Cassandra's lies, to reclaim my son's heritage, and to finally, irrevocably, expose her for the manipulative, deceitful, and ultimately rather pathetic individual she truly was. The moment for its unveiling was rapidly approaching. The mediation session regarding Leo's Christmas holiday schedule, which had been derailed by Cassandra's venomous outburst, eventually sputtered to an unsatisfactory, temporary truce. Ms. Albright, clearly out of her depth and visibly relieved to bring the acrimonious encounter to a close, suggested we reconvene after the new year, perhaps when emotions are less heightened. Cassandra had agreed with an alacrity that I found suspicious, a smug, almost triumphant glint in her eye. She clearly believed she had landed a significant blow, that her insinuations about Leo's paternity had unsettled me, perhaps even intimidated me into future concessions. She had no idea what was coming. As we left the mediation center, Leo's small hand clasped tightly in mine, I felt a cold, hard resolve settle within me. Cassandra's cruelty, her willingness to use our son as a pawn in her endless, avaricious games, had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. The time for quiet endurance, for polite deflection, was over. It was time for the truth in all its stark, unassailable clarity. I took Leo for an ice cream, his favorite antidote to any unpleasantness, his innocent chatter about school, and Pokemon a welcome balm to my own frayed nerves. I didn't mention Cassandra's outburst, didn't allude to the storm that was about to break. My priority was to shield him, as much as possible, from the adult ugliness that his mother seemed so determined to inflict upon our lives. That evening, after Leo was safely tucked in a bed at my apartment, I called Alastair Finch. "Alastair," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion, "it's time. Cassandra has made her move. Now it's ours." Alastair, ever the consummate professional, simply replied, "Understood, Thomas. I have the necessary documents prepared. When and where would you like to present your findings?" We decided on a formal setting, one that would underscore the gravity of the situation and leave no room for Cassandra's usual theatrical evasions. Alastair would request an urgent, private meeting with Cassandra and her current legal counsel, a notoriously aggressive but ultimately rather superficial litigator named Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for bluster far exceeded his actual legal acumen. The agenda for the meeting would be stated simply as a critical matter pertaining to the long-term welfare and legal standing of Leo Ashton Miller. I had insisted, during the divorce, that Leo carry both our surnames, a small act of paternal assertion that had infuriated Cassandra at the time, but one I now cherished. The meeting was scheduled for 3 days later, in the neutral territory of Alastair's own imposing, oak-paneled conference room. I spent the intervening days in a state of focused, almost preternatural calm. I reviewed the DNA test results again, though I knew them by heart. The probability of paternity, 99.9999%. Irrefutable, undeniable. I also reread the accompanying legal affidavits, prepared by Alastair, attesting to the chain of custody of the samples, the unimpeachable reputation of the testing facility, the scientific certainty of the findings. There were no loopholes, no ambiguities, no room for Cassandra's usual brand of obfuscation. This was not a matter of opinion, or interpretation, or emotional manipulation. This was a matter of cold, hard, scientific fact. The morning of the meeting, I dressed with particular care, choosing a dark, conservative suit, a crisp white shirt, a sober tie. I wanted to project an aura of quiet, unshakable authority, the demeanor of a man presenting not a personal grievance, but an unassailable case. Cassandra arrived with Marcus Thorne in tow, her expression a mixture of defiance and a certain nervous apprehension. She clearly didn't know what to expect, but my insistence on this formal meeting through solicitors had obviously unsettled her. Thorne, by contrast, was all bluster and condescension, attempting to take control of the proceedings from the outset with a series of preemptive demands and veiled threats about parental alienation and vexatious litigation. Alastair listened patiently, his face an unreadable mask, until Thorne had finally exhausted his initial barrage of legalistic hot air. Then, Alastair leaned forward, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "Mr. Thorne," he began, "we are not here today to discuss hypothetical grievances or to engage in rhetorical posturing. We are here to address a specific and profoundly serious matter concerning the paternity of Leo Ashton Miller, a matter raised repeatedly and with considerable malice by your client, Ms. Cassandra Ashton." Cassandra flinched, her eyes darting towards Thorne as if seeking reassurance. Thorne, however, suddenly looked a little less cocksure. The word paternity, delivered with Alastair's grave precision, clearly hadn't been on his anticipated agenda. "My client," Thorne began, attempting to recover his swagger, "has merely expressed certain understandable maternal concerns, given Mr. Miller's, shall we say, less than conventional familial resemblance to the child." "Indeed, Mr. Thorne?" Alastair replied, his voice like silk draped over steel. "Well, it seems Mr. Miller, in his desire to allay any such maternal concerns and to ensure, for Leo's sake, that there is absolute, unequivocal clarity on this matter, has taken the rather sensible and scientifically definitive step of ascertaining the facts." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. Then, he reached into his own pristine leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, sealed envelope, identical to the one resting in my own. "This, Mr. Thorne, Ms. Ashton," Alastair said, placing the envelope on the polished mahogany table between them, "is a certified, court-admissible report from the accredited Paternity Diagnostics Laboratory of Geneva, Switzerland, detailing the results of a comprehensive DNA analysis conducted using samples from Mr. Thomas Ashton and Master Leo Ashton Miller." Cassandra stared at the envelope as if it were a ticking bomb. Thorne's jaw, which had been working rather aggressively on a piece of chewing gum, suddenly stilled. The air in the room was thick with unspoken dread, theirs, not mine. "Before you open that, Ms. Ashton," Alastair continued, his gaze unwavering, "perhaps you would care to reiterate, for the record, your previous assertions regarding Mr. Miller's biological relationship, or lack thereof, to your son?" Cassandra swallowed hard, her eyes flicking from the envelope to Alistair, then to me. Her carefully constructed facade of arrogant indifference was beginning to crumble, revealing the raw panic beneath. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, seemingly incapable of speech. Marcus Thorne, however, ever the aggressive litigator, made one last, desperate attempt to seize the offensive. "This is outrageous," he blustered. "An ambush. My client is under no obligation to respond to such underscore-handed tactics. We have no way of verifying the authenticity of this supposed report." "Oh, I assure you, Mr. Thorne," Alistair replied, a thin, dangerous smile playing on his lips, "its authenticity is impeccable, as is the chain of custody. And as for Ms. Ashton's obligation to respond, well, that will largely depend on whether she wishes to face potential charges of perjury, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, should the contents of this report contradict the very public and very damaging statements she has repeatedly made regarding Leo's paternity. Statements, I might add, that have caused considerable harm not just to Mr. Miller, but more importantly, to the child himself." He then gestured towards the envelope. "The truth, Ms. Ashton, Mr. Thorne, is in that envelope. I suggest you acquaint yourselves with it. And then, perhaps, we can discuss the rather significant legal and personal consequences of your client's prolonged and malicious campaign of deception." The moment of reckoning had arrived. The final, irrefutable data point was on the table. And Cassandra's world, built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, was about to be comprehensively and very publicly demolished by the simple, unassailable power of scientific fact. Cassandra's hand trembled as she reached for the envelope Alistair Finch had placed so deliberately on the polished mahogany table. Marcus Thorne, her solicitor, watched her, his earlier bluster replaced by a wary, almost predatory stillness. He knew, as did I, that whatever was in that envelope had the potential to irrevocably alter the landscape of this already contentious dispute. With fumbling fingers, Cassandra broke the seal and withdrew the contents. Her eyes scanned the first page of the Paternity Diagnostics Laboratory report, her breath catching in her throat. I saw her knuckles whiten as she gripped the paper, her gaze flicking back and forth between the complex genetic markers and the stark, unambiguous conclusion printed at the bottom. The silence in Alistair's conference room was absolute, broken only by the faint rustle of the document in Cassandra's shaking hand and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of city traffic. Then a small choke sound escaped her lips, a sound that was part gasp, part sob. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking suddenly old, haggard, the expensive, carefully applied makeup unable to conceal the raw shock and dawning, horrified comprehension in her eyes. She dropped the report onto the table as if it had burned her fingers. Marcus Thorne, his expression unreadable, picked it up, his own eyes quickly scanning the damning conclusion. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. Mr. Thomas Ashton cannot be excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Ashton Miller. Thorne placed the report back on the table, slowly, deliberately. He then looked at Cassandra, a long, appraising look that held no sympathy, only a lawyer's cold assessment of a case that had just, in spectacular fashion, imploded. "Well, Ms. Ashton," Thorne said finally, his voice devoid of its earlier aggression, now flat, almost weary. "It appears Mr. Miller's foresight has been rather comprehensive. This report is, shall we say, conclusive." Cassandra simply stared at him, her mouth working, but no words emerging. The weapon she had wielded with such cruel, casual abandon for so long. The insinuation, the outright lie, that I was not Leo's father, had just been definitively and very publicly neutralized. More than neutralized, it had been turned back on her, exposing her not just as a liar, but as a malicious, manipulative individual willing to sacrifice her own son's emotional well-being for the sake of a petty, vindictive vendetta. Alistair Finch then spoke, his voice calm, measured, but carrying the unmistakable weight of legal authority. "Ms. Ashton, Mr. Thorne," he began, "in light of this irrefutable evidence, several matters now require our immediate attention. Firstly, there is the issue of your client's repeated, public, and demonstrably false statements regarding Leo's paternity. These statements constitute defamation and have caused significant emotional distress to both Mr. Miller and, more importantly, to Master Leo. Mr. Miller is, of course, within his rights to pursue legal remedies for this." Cassandra flinched as if struck. The thought of a defamation suit, of her lies being further exposed in a public court, clearly terrified her. "Secondly," Alastair continued, relentless in his precision, "there's the matter of your client's conduct during the previous mediation sessions, and indeed, throughout the divorce proceedings. Her consistent and malicious use of false paternity claims as a means of emotional blackmail and attempted financial coercion could be construed as a serious abuse of process, and perhaps even contempt of court, given the existing custody orders." Thorne shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He knew Alastair was not making idle threats. The legal ground beneath their feet was rapidly turning into quicksand. "And thirdly, Ms. Ashton," Alastair's gaze, when it rested on Cassandra, was like chipped ice. "There's the not insignificant matter of Leo's future emotional well-being. Your actions have demonstrated a profound and disturbing willingness to prioritize your own grievances over the stability and security of your son. This raises serious questions about your suitability as a primary custodial parent, questions that Mr. Miller, as Leo's now unequivocally confirmed biological father, is entirely justified in asking the court to consider." This was the true bombshell, the one Cassandra, in her arrogance, had never seen coming. She had used Leo's paternity as a weapon against me, believing it gave her power, leverage. She had never considered that the truth, when revealed, could strip her of that power, and potentially of her primary role in Leo's life. Her face, which had been pale with shock, now crumpled in a mask of genuine, unadulterated terror. "No," she cried, her voice a raw, ragged sound. "You can't. He's my son. You can't take my son away from me." "Ms. Ashton," I said, speaking for the first time since the report had been revealed, my voice quiet but firm, my gaze unwavering. "This was never about taking Leo away from you. This was about stopping you from taking me away from him, with your lies, with your poison. This was about protecting our son from your destructive games." I paused, letting my words sink in. "For years, Cassandra, you have used Leo as a pawn. You have questioned his identity, his heritage, his very place in this world, simply to wound me, to try and extract some perceived advantage. You have shown a reckless disregard for his emotional well-being, for the confusion and pain your actions have caused him. That stops today." I leaned forward, my eyes never leaving hers. "The DNA test, the one you so arrogantly dismissed, has confirmed what I have always known in my heart, what Leo has always deserved to know without a shadow of a doubt. I am his father, his real, biological, and loving father. And as his father, I will do whatever is necessary to protect him, to ensure he grows up in a stable, honest, and emotionally secure environment, free from your manipulations and your lies." Marcus Thorne, seeing his client's case and quite possibly his own reputation dissolving before his eyes, finally intervened, his voice now a desperate, placating whine. "Mr. Finch, Mr. Miller, please. My client is distraught. She acted impulsively, out of distress following a difficult divorce. Surely, we can find some amicable resolution here, some way to move forward that doesn't involve further litigation." Alastair Finch looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. My goal was not to destroy Cassandra, however much she deserved it. My goal was to protect Leo and to secure my undisputed place in his life. "Mr. Thorne," Alastair said, his voice still firm but with a hint of pragmatic concession, "Mr. Miller is not an unreasonable man. He is, however, a deeply committed father. What he requires, What Leo requires is an immediate and permanent cessation of all false claims and insinuations regarding Leo's paternity. He requires a legally binding agreement, an addendum to your existing custody order, stipulating that any future such pronouncements by Ms. Ashton will result in an immediate review of her custodial rights, with a strong presumption in Mr. Miller's favor. He also requires, Alastair continued, his gaze now fixed on Cassandra, a full, unreserved, and witnessed apology from you, Ms. Ashton. An apology not just to Mr. Miller, but, at an appropriate time and in an appropriate manner, to Leo himself, for the confusion and distress your actions have caused him. Cassandra stared at him, her mouth agape. An apology? A legally binding gag order on her favorite weapon? It was clearly more than she had ever bargained for. But the alternative, the prospect of a protracted custody battle she was now almost certain to lose, combined with potential defamation suits and court sanctions, was clearly even more terrifying. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, reluctantly, Cassandra nodded, a single, jerky movement. I agree, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The fight had gone out of her. The truth, in all its stark, scientific, and legally binding glory, had finally, comprehensively, won. The envelope had done its work, and the future, for Leo, and for me, suddenly looked a lot clearer, a lot brighter, and a lot more real. The signing of the revised custody agreement and Cassandra's witnessed, if somewhat stilted, apology to me took place in Alastair Finch's office a week later. Marcus Thorne, looking considerably less confident than at our previous encounter, was present, as was a court-appointed child psychologist, Dr. Evans, whose role was to advise on the best way to eventually explain the situation to Leo, and to ensure that Cassandra's apology to him, when it occurred, was age-appropriate and genuinely reparative, rather than another exercise in manipulative self-pity. Cassandra's apology to me was a perfunctory, mumbled affair, clearly delivered under duress and the steely gaze of her own solicitor. She couldn't quite meet my eyes, her earlier arrogance replaced by a sullen, resentful compliance. I accepted it with a cool, formal nod. My concern was not for her feelings, but for the legal finality of the document she was about to sign. The addendum to the custody order was ironclad. It explicitly forbade Cassandra from ever again questioning Leo's paternity, publicly or privately, and stipulated severe, immediate consequences for any breach, including a potential forfeiture of her custodial rights. It also outlined a clear framework for co-parenting, emphasizing mutual respect, transparent communication, through a court-monitored app at Alastair's insistence, to prevent further verbal harassment from her, and an unwavering focus on Leo's best interests. It was, in essence, a legally binding muzzle on her malice. After the documents were signed and witnessed, a heavy, awkward silence descended on the room. It was broken by Dr. Evans, the child psychologist, a kind, sensible woman with a calm, reassuring demeanor. Mr. Miller, Ms. Ashton, she began, we now need to consider Leo. He is a bright, sensitive child, and he is undoubtedly aware of the tensions between you. He deserves an honest, age-appropriate explanation of what has transpired, one that reassures him of both your love and his own secure place in this family, regardless of your past difficulties. We discussed it at length. It was agreed that Cassandra would, in Dr. Evans's presence, offer Leo a simple, heartfelt apology for causing him confusion and worry, without going into the complex and sordid details of her paternity lies. She would reassure him of her love and affirm, unequivocally, that I was his father and that nothing would ever change that. My own conversation with Leo, Dr. Evans advised, should focus on reinforcing his sense of security, on validating his feelings, and on reassuring him that the adult conflicts were not his fault and that both his parents loved him dearly. It was a difficult path to navigate, but a necessary one. The actual conversation between Cassandra and Leo, which took place a few days later in Dr. Evans's comfortable, child-friendly office, was, from what Dr. Evans later relayed to me, surprisingly successful. Cassandra, perhaps coached by Thorne on the potential repercussions of failing this particular test, or perhaps, just perhaps, experiencing a flicker of genuine maternal remorse, managed to deliver a simple, seemingly sincere apology. She told Leo she had said some silly, untrue things when she was angry and upset, and that she was very sorry if those things had worried him. She hugged him, told him she loved him, and, crucially, affirmed that I was and always would be his dad. Leo, with the innocent, forgiving heart of a child, had simply hugged her back. My own conversation with Leo that evening was more nuanced. We didn't discuss Cassandra's lies directly. Instead, we talked about families, about how sometimes parents disagree, about how love can be complicated, but how his place, his identity, his relationship with both of us was unshakable, built on a foundation of truth and unwavering affection. I showed him the DNA report, not the complex genetic markers, but the simple, clear conclusion framed not as a refutation of a lie, but as a wonderful, scientific confirmation of a beautiful truth we had always known in our hearts. "See, buddy," I said, pointing to the 99.9999%. "Science says you're stuck with me as your dad. Forever." He grinned, a wide, happy, gap-toothed smile that melted away the last vestiges of the tension and anxiety that had clouded his young face for so long. "Good," he'd said simply, "because you make the best pancakes, and you always know how to fix my Lego spaceships." In the weeks and months that followed, a new, more peaceful, if somewhat more distant, equilibrium settled into our co-parenting relationship. Cassandra, stripped of her most potent weapon and constrained by the legally binding terms of our agreement, became manageable. Her interactions with me were conducted strictly through the court-monitored app, confined to logistical arrangements for Leo's schedule. Her attempts at emotional manipulation or financial coercion ceased entirely. She seemed to understand, at last, that the game was over, and she had comprehensively lost. Leo thrived. The removal of that underlying current of tension, of unspoken doubt, had a profoundly positive impact on him. He became more relaxed, more confident, his natural curiosity and intelligence blossoming. Our weekends together were filled with laughter, with shared adventures, with the quiet, everyday joys of a father and son secure in their bond. My father's trust, the one that had so infuriated Cassandra, continued to provide for Leo's education and well-being, ensuring he would have every opportunity to pursue his dreams, unencumbered by his mother's past financial recklessness or her emotional machinations. As for me, the forensic botanist who had been forced to apply his analytical skills to the rather toxic soil of his own family life, I found a measure of peace I hadn't thought possible. The truth, however painful its unearthing, had indeed set us free. The envelope, that simple repository of scientific fact, had been more than just a piece of evidence. It had been a key, unlocking a future where honesty, integrity, and a child's unshakable sense of belonging were the only narratives that truly mattered. The case at long last was closed, and the findings, I knew, would resonate for a lifetime. The years that followed the definitive resolution of Leo's paternity and the establishment of firm, legally binding boundaries with Cassandra were characterized by a steady, if sometimes challenging, reconstruction of our family's emotional landscape. Leo, the primary beneficiary of this newfound stability, blossomed, freed from the insidious undercurrent of his mother's manipulations and the unspoken anxieties that had once clouded his young life. He grew into a confident, articulate, and remarkably well-adjusted young man. His passion for science, a trait he undoubtedly inherited from me, flourished, and he excelled in his studies, his curiosity about the natural world boundless. Our father-son bond, always strong, deepened into a relationship of mutual respect and easy companionship. We spent countless hours exploring nature trails, conducting amateur scientific experiments in my home lab, a significant upgrade from his childhood Lego spaceships, and engaging in long, rambling conversations about everything from quantum physics to the migratory patterns of monarch butterflies. He never again mentioned Cassandra's earlier, poisonous insinuations. The truth, presented to him simply and lovingly, had been a powerful antidote, inoculating him against any lingering doubts. Cassandra, for her part, seemed to gradually, if grudgingly, adapt to the new reality. The court-monitored communication app, while initially a source of frustration for her, her attempts to inject emotional drama or veiled financial pleas into routine scheduling discussions were invariably flagged and shut down by Alastair Finch's vigilant paralegals, eventually imposed a discipline on her interactions that was, frankly, beneficial for all involved. Her relationship with Leo, while never achieving the easy, uncomplicated affection he shared with me, settled into a pattern of polite, if somewhat distant, maternal connection. She attended his school events, remembered his birthdays, albeit with gifts that were now, by necessity, more modest and less performative, and generally adhered to the terms of our custody agreement. The fire of her avarice and her malice towards me seemed to have been largely extinguished, or at least banked down into sullen embers. She eventually remarried, to a man whose financial standing was considerably less aspirational than her previous targets, and whose tolerance for drama was, by all accounts, significantly lower. This, perhaps, contributed to her more subdued demeanor. My own life, too, found a new, more peaceful rhythm. My work as a forensic botanist continued to be challenging and fulfilling, but it no longer consumed me in the same way. I made more time for personal pursuits, for friendships, for simply enjoying the quiet satisfaction of a life well-ordered and free from unnecessary conflict. Alastair Finch remained a trusted friend and advisor, our professional relationship having forged a bond of mutual respect that transcended mere legal counsel. We'd often meet for lunch, discussing not just the intricacies of trust law or the latest developments in DNA forensics, but also the more philosophical aspects of life, of justice, of the enduring human capacity for both remarkable resilience and astonishing self-deception. He once remarked, a wry smile on his face, "You know, Thomas, in all my years of practice, I've rarely seen a case where a single, well-timed envelope had such a comprehensively clarifying effect. It was a masterclass in strategic patience and irrefutable evidence. Your father, Harrison, would have admired your thoroughness." The mention of my father brought a pang of wistful affection. He had passed away a few years after the divorce, his final years blessedly free from Cassandra's financial machinations, his legacy secure by the very trusts he had so wisely established. I often thought of his early, prescient warnings about Cassandra, warnings I had so naively dismissed. He had seen her true nature long before I had, and he had, in his own way, tried to protect me. His trust, and the quiet strength of his example, had been a far more valuable inheritance than any monetary sum. One crisp autumn afternoon, many years after the events in Ms. Albright's mediation room, I was attending Leo's high school graduation. He was the valedictorian, his speech a brilliant, witty, and surprisingly moving reflection on the importance of seeking truth, of questioning assumptions, and of the quiet power of perseverance. As he stood at the podium, confident, articulate, his eyes shining with intelligence and a deep, kind humor, I felt an overwhelming surge of pride, a feeling so profound it almost took my breath away. Cassandra was there, in the audience, looking older, more subdued, but with a genuine, if somewhat wistful, smile on her face as she watched her son. Later, at the small family celebration we hosted at my apartment, Leo, in a quiet moment, pulled me aside. "Dad," he said, his voice earnest, I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for always being there, for always being real." He didn't need to say more. I understood. The unspoken history, the shadows of the past, were acknowledged and then, gently, set aside. The truth, the simple, unshakable truth of our bond, was all that mattered. The envelope, that symbol of a hard-won victory over lies and manipulation, had long since been archived, its purpose served. Its contents had not just confirmed a biological fact. They had secured a child's future, silenced a campaign of malice, and ultimately paved the way for a more honest, more peaceful, and far more authentic existence for all of us. The final report on that particular forensic investigation was one of quiet, enduring, and entirely satisfying resolution. The botanical traces of deceit had been meticulously identified, analyzed, and eradicated, allowing for the flourishing of a much healthier and infinitely more precious family tree.